It begins by depicting a situation where a team of U.S. Army snipers is monitoring an operation to capture a key Iraqi terrorist leader. This leader is being apprehended because he is believed to possess critical information that could be highly valuable.
Eyes on, boys. Humvee's here.
Meanwhile, several supporters of the militant leader were not idle. They devised a strategy to disrupt the capture operation, one of which involved neutralizing the sniper team first.
My position's been compromised. I repeat, my position.
And yes, one of the 3 snipers was successfully taken down. The situation caused Frank, the leader of the team, to lose his composure and make impulsive decisions. As a result, the situation escalated, leading to unintended harm to those involved. 10 years passed, and Frank had long left his military life behind. However, he couldn't deny that the events of a decade ago still weighed heavily on his mind. To this day, he hadn't found the strength to share his story with anyone. In his retirement, Frank spent his days keeping busy with various activities at his auto repair shop. On that particular day, he and one of his employees had just finished repairing a car, which was now ready to be delivered to its owner. Meet Casey, a beautiful woman who is Frank's wife. When they got married, Casey already had a daughter named Shannon. Despite this, Frank treated Shannon as if she were his own biological daughter. Knowing that Frank would receive payment from the car's owner, Casey and Shannon insisted on joining him to deliver it, while persuading Frank to take them on a weekend getaway. Reluctantly, Frank agreed, though he couldn't shake off a sense of unease, especially since the car's owner was a mafia boss who had once worked for him in the past. Upon arriving at the destination, Frank was confronted by a burly bodyguard whose arrogant attitude led to a heated argument that escalated into a physical fight. Fortunately, an insider named Lazarus stepped in to break it up and quickly escorted Frank to meet the boss, Cleo.
Lucky Frank, always a perfectionist.
Frank was taken aback by the contents of the envelope he received. The amount of money inside was far too much to be just payment for a car repair.
You'd like some real work.
It turned out that Cleo wanted Frank to return to working for him as a hitman. However, Frank refused the offer and left, taking the envelope with him. Night fell, and deep down, Frank briefly contemplated the idea of returning to the mafia world with Cleo. However, he was still determined to avoid going down that path again. His thoughts were interrupted by a shocking news report on television. Cleo's daughter had been killed in a hit-and-run incident. The news hit Frank hard, knowing how much Cleo deeply loved his daughter.
We will bring you updates on this developing story.
Shortly after, Lazarus arrived with 2 of his men. Their purpose was to deliver a message. Cleo wanted Frank to take care of the person responsible for his daughter's death.
It's just me fixing an automobile. I'm not interested.
After being pressured by Lazarus, Frank reluctantly agreed to meet Cleo that very night. However, he chose not to inform Casey, his wife, about the purpose of his departure. This secrecy led Casey to suspect that Frank was hiding something significant from her, something he had kept secret for a long time. The more curious Casey became, the more determined Frank was to keep quiet about the matter. His refusal to explain only fueled her frustration, leaving Casey increasingly upset. Yes, Casey, overwhelmed with frustration, expressed her anger toward Frank, but he chose to remain calm and said nothing. Without further confrontation, Frank quietly left and made his way to Cleo's house. As a grieving father, Cleo was still struggling to come to terms with the tragic loss of his daughter, especially since the perpetrator remained free. Determined to seek vengeance, Cleo pressured Frank to eliminate the culprit. If Frank refused, Cleo threatened to reveal secrets from Frank's past to his wife.
This calls for the silencer.
Reluctantly, Frank agreed to Cleo's request. Meanwhile, Lazarus, who already had detailed information about the perpetrator, handed it over to Frank and urged him to carry out the task without delay.
Let's never be scared with you, Les.
From the data provided, Frank was able to trace the perpetrator's whereabouts with ease, making it almost certain that he could carry out the task before the target turned himself in to the authorities. However, upon discovering that the target was with his family, Frank was immediately reminded of the horrific events from 10 years ago. Unfortunately, this caused Frank to be trapped in a moral dilemma. In the end, he decided to let the perpetrator go. Shortly after, the police arrived and apprehended the target. What Frank had just done, letting the perpetrator go, was witnessed by one of Lazarus's men. The news quickly reached Cleo, who, furious over the betrayal, ordered Lazarus to step in and hunt down both Frank and the target.
Kill her.
Meanwhile, at home, Casey was startled by the sound of the phone ringing, which she believed was a call from Frank. However, feeling uneasy and worried that something might be wrong, she decided to check her surroundings first. Suddenly, feeling threatened, Casey attempted to defend herself, but her efforts were in vain. Instead of de-escalating the situation, it only fueled Lazarus's anger, prompting him to react aggressively and unpredictably.
Les, what about the kid?
A short while later, Frank returned home and found Casey unconscious at the front door in a critical condition. Without hesitation, he rushed her to the nearest hospital. Meanwhile, at the same time, Lazarus was preparing to execute the perpetrator immediately. Back with Frank, he was visited by an old comrade named Timo, who had heard about Shannon's abduction by Cleo's group. Willing to lend a hand, Timo offered his help to Frank to resolve the situation and bring Shannon back safely.
Cass.
On the other hand, Casey was deeply shaken, not only worried about the safety of her kidnapped daughter, but also devastated by the realization that Frank had been hiding the truth from her all this time. To make amends, Frank, with Timo's support, vowed to bring Shannon home safely, no matter what it took.
I will get her back.
Before long, their journey brought them to Cleo's residence, which appeared eerily quiet. Fortunately, they found one man who could potentially provide information about where Cleo had taken Shannon. However, before they could extract any details, the man suddenly attacked Frank, left with no other choice. Timo shot the attacker, killing him on the spot. It was later discovered that Cleo, still unable to come to terms with his daughter's death, had taken Shannon to his hometown and kept her captive there. Though he treated her as if she were his own child, Cleo's wife disapproved of his excessive actions and openly criticized his behavior. As a former partner of Cleo, Frank knew exactly where his daughter was being held, at a location in Mexico that Cleo had turned into a drug manufacturing facility. Armed and heavily fortified, the area was well guarded. However, Frank and Timo managed to infiltrate the site and overpower all the guards, successfully taking control of the compound. Lazarus quickly mobilized all his men to surround the area, giving orders to eliminate Frank and his team. Unbeknownst to them, Frank and Timo were already at one of Cleo's bars, where the burly bodyguard was casually playing cards. From the burly bodyguard, Frank managed to extract more detailed information about Shannon's whereabouts. Meanwhile, outside the bar, Timo was taking down Cleo's henchmen in a fierce fight. Amid the chaos, the bodyguard also met his end during the confrontation. Considering the increasingly dangerous situation for Cleo, Lazarus used all his skills to protect him by directing an assault up the hill where Frank and his team were stationed. Armed with long-range weapons, Frank and Timo were ready, and an intense firefight broke out, leaving no room for negotiation.
You might want to get down.
At the same time, Lazarus was caught off guard when Frank suddenly appeared from behind. Although Frank initially tried to approach him calmly and talk things through, the panicked Lazarus reacted aggressively instead. Left with no choice, Frank delivered a precise shot, taking Lazarus down.
I can't do that, Frank.
Timo wasn't so fortunate, as the shootout had left him gravely injured. Despite his critical condition, he urged Frank to go after Shannon immediately, warning him that Cleo would escape with her at any moment if Frank didn't act quickly.
Come on, be careful.
Behind Cleo's actions, his wife continuously tried to reason with him, reminding him that Shannon was clearly not their daughter. However, Cleo stubbornly ignored her pleas and remained fixated on his plan. Amid their heated argument, Shannon seized the moment to bite Cleo, breaking his concentration and catching him off guard.
That's right here.
This gave Frank the opening he needed to neutralize Cleo. With a well-aimed strike, he drove a knife directly into Cleo's chest, fatally wounding him. Cleo succumbed to the injury and died on the spot. After enduring a long and exhausting journey, Frank was finally able to fulfill his promise to his wife by bringing Shannon home safely. From that point on, the family began to rebuild their bond, restoring the harmony they once had.
My name is Frank.